So to open this event, we have my good friend who is part of the diaspora from the UK, from Europe, who I met when he was at an organization called the World Economic Forum, where he spent 16 years in the organization really running their sustainability initiatives and operation. And for 3 years, he was on the board of the World Economic Forum. He then left subsequently to join another organization. I don't know why. In the climate space, every organization has acronyms, WEF. But now he's at a different organization, equally important and doing great work, called WBCSD. And please see Dominic Waughray after his presentation to unpack the acronym. So without further ado, Dominic has been a force in the climate space, like I said, for 16 years at WEF and now at WBCSD, where he's an executive vice president. He runs some of their biggest programs in the organization, and he's been part of COP forever. So who better to kick us off today than to have someone who's been to probably literally every COP in the last decade plus to really give us a perspective on what's happening here, what's at stake, and what the future holds. So please welcome Dominic Waughray.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are watching online. It gives me huge pleasure to be here at the Diaspora Climate Action Forum. I guess my chops for this is my father was from Hyderabad in India. He moved over in 1952 and went to university. So I grew up in the UK. But in my lifetime, I've seen, as Amar, you were saying, just the rise of the influence of the diaspora around the world from India in terms of technology and innovation and finance and new ideas, not only in IT and perhaps healthcare, but also increasingly in green tech and increasingly in the climate agenda. So it gives me great honor to be here to talk to you about that. The organization that I represent, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, has about 230 leading multinationals in it. Market cap, about 16 trillion dollars, about kind of 14 million employees around the world, all sectors, but importantly, all committed to tackling climate change, nature, and inequality all at the same time. So we have a membership criteria to be in. It's like a leading club. If we kind of step back a little bit and look at the challenge, just some kind of 101. So we live at the end of a period, for those who are looking at these things from a scientific perspective, called the Holocene. That's lasted about 12,000 years. And until perhaps our generation, there was only really a variation of 1 degree either side of what we remember to be kind of summer, autumn, winter, or pre-monsoon, monsoon, post-monsoon. That meant that people, human-related species who'd been around 160,000 years, could start to stay in one place rather than move around and have agriculture, then towns and cities and religion and all sorts of things. That's about 12,000 years ago. About 1820, the Industrial Revolution started, and that's where things have changed, and that's why people who look at these things think we're at the end of a Holocene and are deciding to suggest we're now in the Anthropocene, because the human impact on our climate systems in those last, let's say, kind of less than 200 years has been quite extraordinary compared to historic precedents. And that is because of the release of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and also other related greenhouse gas emissions from those production processes. So to give you some context, in total we've released since about 1850 2,500 billion, that's 2,500 gigatons of fossil fuels since 1850. The people who know about all of these things suggest that we've only got about 500 billion tons, 500 gigatons left in our so-called carbon budget before we put so much energy into the atmosphere that things all go wrong. Because all of this released carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, what they do is that they provide this, that's why it's called the greenhouse gas effect, they provide a bit of a shield where the sunshine can come through, but the warmth can't go back. And that provides more energy in the atmosphere, and that's why we talk about not just warm, but more storms and sea surges and things like that. There's just more fizz in the atmosphere because of all this trapped energy. And the budget that we have is only about 500 gigatons left, 2,500 gigatons so far. So that's why it's quite urgent, because this problem started in 1850, but if you can imagine a hockey stick curve, it's only really since 1950, 1970, and 1990 that we've had a real surge in some of these emissions. And that's the challenge, because historically, the US has put 509 gigatons into the atmosphere, about 25% so far, but China has already put kind of 18% in, the EU collectively 22%, India 3%, but the China and India bits are only really since the kind of rise in development. So what we're seeing is not just a historic long tail, but if we are going to increase prosperity and development and growth, then focusing on the kind of energy solutions that we had before is going to be quite troublesome. So there is this big debate, you've heard the phrase loss and damage, that those people who put all of this trapped heat into the atmosphere before should be paying for something, and that is a very, very pertinent debate. But also, it's not just a backcast thing, it's a forwardcast thing, because we can't have business as usual moving forward, otherwise we're going to bust through that carbon budget. And the growth that is occurring in terms of those energy emissions is mostly now from these emerging or developing economies. So it's kind of a real conundrum. You know, there is a backcasting bit, there is a loss and damage, but there's also an important trajectory that needs to change for development and growth, particularly over the next decade. In fact, many scientists say we need to kind of pivot by 2030, which is only 7 years away. Otherwise, we'll not be on course to be within that carbon budget by 2050. When you hear the phrase net zero, that's because we want to avoid being over those 3,000 gigatons by 2050, because that means we keep ourselves within a 50% chance of not going above 1.5 degrees, because the scientists say if we go above 1.5 degrees, everything gets chaotic in the weather systems. Sadly, we've already had 2 days this year, for the first time ever since that Holocene period began, and certainly since records began in 1850, where we've hit 1.5 degrees. And all of us know, whichever part of the world we're from, that it's been a particularly challenging summer in the north and winter in the south. You've seen monsoon patterns change. We've seen kind of snow dumps, we've seen storm surges. We've seen the implications of that with insurance companies deciding that there are some parts of San Francisco and California, where many of you live, that are kind of uninsurable. We see that now in parts of southern Europe, and if this starts to happen in emerging and developing economies, then you can see how the climate challenge starts to impact on the development challenge. Because how is one supposed to be able to invest in one's business or indeed one's home, create assets, create wealth, if suddenly insurance premiums are either so high or just not there? The implication of that, of course, is, well, I better move to somewhere where there is an insurance premium, I can get a mortgage, and you can see the cascade. So these are very real challenges. It's not a sort of abstract thing that somebody's going to fix scientifically. It is an economic transformation that has to occur on the back of a historical growth trajectory where there is some transfer of resources to compensate for what happened. But importantly, it's all about the future, because there's only those 500 gigatons of space left in the carbon budget, which brings us to India, brings us to China, brings us to Indonesia, brings us to Brazil. To illustrate that, in 2020, the United States, if we kind of just use that as a sort of reference point, in 2020, the United States had about 20 tons of global greenhouse gas emission CO2 equivalent per person. 2020. In 2019, that was down to 14.9 per capita emissions. India has about 1.8 tons per capita of emissions. You can see what's happening. One is going down, and if we don't have change this trajectory, another one will go up. And at some point, and maybe you could argue 2040, given the trajectory that the US is on, you're going to have a crosswire. And if we have that, then you bet the politics will change in terms of this discussion about, who is doing what. So this is not a static piece. So those of you who think, well, this was a historic mistake and suddenly we need to be compensated for that, there's an element of it, but there's an element of where is the new economy and growth trajectory coming from, which we must address. Now, if we break this down, of course, this is where it gets quite interesting. If we're like a boardroom, you'd say, okay, I get it, there's a big systemic, complicated problem, slice this up for me. What do we do? What do we do? Well, in terms of a pie chart of where all of these greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and therefore the things that we can attack and change, the energy system is about 73% of the challenge. That's where most emissions come from globally. Industry about 24%, transport about 12%, of which aviation, interestingly, is about 2%, shipping about 2%. Aviation's a super interesting one, because everyone focuses on the aviation sector because it's a sort of poster child of what needs to happen. But if you put it into context, it's fast growing, and it does need kind of a change in trajectory. But industry, heavy industry overall, about 24%, transport about 12%. Other unallocated industrial emissions like methane and things like that, plus other things which are difficult to measure, but we know it's coming from the industrial sector, takes us to another 9.5 or so percent. Waste, for example, so methane and such from untreated kind of waste dumping, 3.2% globally. Agriculture, forestry, land use, about 18.4%. So a big chunk, about 3/4, industry, related energy emissions, another kind of quarter really sort of land use, and then some small slices. When we go into industry, as I mentioned, here comes transport, but here comes some heavy industry sectors, cement, chemicals, aluminium, steel, and you can break down, people have kind of broken these down into these particular chunks. So you can see where we can get at this now, because that gives us swim lanes to then focus on. What is the process in steel, for example, that can reduce the emissions but produce us steel? Can we have green steel? How do we move away from coal into hydrogen as a green fuel that can give us steel? How, therefore, do we get lots of cheap feedstock of hydrogen, which at the moment is quite high up in terms of the cost curve of the technology? How do we bring it down? Is that a combination of public and private? Does that mean the government, whatever government, or a club of governments needs to invest in bringing down the cost curve of green hydrogen, scaling up renewables to provide the energy for the green hydrogen, which are not the same renewables that people would be using for their household energy? We can't displace clean energy for people with clean energy for industry. We need more. Does that take us into who wants to buy the slightly more expensive green steel at the moment? You've probably heard of this greenium. This is a concept that Bill Gates put forward. Very, very interesting, that it's not just on the supply side, it's also on the demand side. If I'm a large purchaser of steel, maybe I'm an OEM in the auto manufacturing side or something, and I say to our friends at JSW Steel, as one example of a steel manufacturer, you know what, this is brilliant. All my customers want circular cars, so I'm going to place an order in the next kind of 10 years for loads of green steel. Can you make it? And I guarantee you, like a PPA, that I'm going to buy all of that. That sort of signal is a really, really useful shift for the industry side. Same for shipping. I ship loads of goods around the world. I might be a large internet-based platform business, and I need to ship lots of things. I might make flat-pack furniture, and I have large stores all around the world. I guarantee, because I need to show to my customers that I've got net zero logistics, hello shipping company, can you create green shipping for me, methanol to ammonia or something over the next decade? Now, those sorts of things are the kind of private to private or public and private activities which can start to flip this switch. Why I'm saying all of that and not kind of talking to you about the details of the negotiations in Dubai is because this is where the action really is. And the negotiations, give or take, apart from the loss and damage fund or one or two others, are all, as you can sense if you're walking around the blue zone, they call it, about how do we unlock the potential and opportunities for business to create those S-curves. So to your point, Emma, you're absolutely right. This becomes not just a challenge, but one of the biggest business industrial opportunities that we have. Some people echo it to the transformation of the digital revolution, where At first we thought, well, okay, I'll get someone in from IT and they can sort of think about what this means in the business. It's not really a disruption. It's sort of, oh, hang on a minute, some of our what happened to all our products and services? We've been swept away. The same thing will happen with this mainstreaming of sustainability and climate-related stuff. The people who don't move, their lunch will get eaten. And we're seeing that from many of our businesses and others, and you can see it in disruptions in the space. EV and solar are two examples of industries which have grown incredibly. I mean, I don't know if I'm looking at if we have a normal distribution curve in the room, I think we're slightly slanted to the younger, but those of us a bit older, I don't think when I was 15, I even imagined that there would be the end of the industrial combustion engine. It wasn't something that was in my mind, and yet we can sense it and smell it here, even the just amount of Teslas that are driving around in Dubai. Now, for India, in particular, this gets quite interesting because for those of you, obviously, from the diaspora who are leading the business business innovation agenda around the world, you can sense those opportunities. Many of the Indian business companies that we talk to, including now from last year, this year from the G20, saying that we could position India maybe as one of the world's leading green fuel providers, with the potential to create green hydrogen and solar and such. And then suddenly we have a very different proposition of what India can provide to the world. Makes it very interesting about the relationship with China. If China's got kit and India's got potential to scale manufacturing, and then where does Europe sit? It needs this stuff. Europe's putting up a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but with the right methodologies to show suppliers upstream providing zero carbon or low carbon input to, for example, that green steel, you enter CBAM. Europe kind of wins because it gets the product it needs around its green transition. India wins in the provision of green fuel, green materials. US is kind of classically trying to make sure that it's reimagining its whole industrial sector through something called the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's playing now into global trade and into the changing kind of economics of the world. So all of this to say, from that beginning about kind of a fluctuation of a degree in the Holocene to where we are now, this is not a kind of, let me just watch that and see what happens and I'll just carry on as BAU. This is a fundamental transformation that is going on. I just want to leave you with one thought about India, which is something that's I've always been curious about. So there has been, for quite some time, a narrative about, well, we have to find the cheapest possible energy source to get to as many people as possible. We have so many billions of people who don't have access to affordable energy. Absolutely true. There's a development challenge. With the cost of solar coming down, making this so much more competitive, there's something interesting going on in what that actually means in Indian terms. Coal was a preferred option for India to get as much cheap energy to people as quickly as possible, particularly subcritical coal, because it's the cheapest form of power plant that there is. Subcritical coal is a very, very thirsty form of energy. 1 megawatt hour of electricity of subcritical coal requires 2,000 litres of water. So you see where I'm going. I'm not going about emissions, I'm going about the water security of building out an energy system in India when we know what's coming ahead with a very, very thirsty option. The International Energy Agency estimate that about 60 billion cubic meters of water would be required by 2035 to deliver the energy requirement that India was looking for from subcritical coal. That means that there's an increase in water needs of the energy and electricity sector up from about 2% in India's energy mix today to 8%. That turns into about 37 million meters cubed of water per annum, which, given 2017 demographic statistics for India, is about one tanker. You can, in your mind, right, you can see a tanker of water that goes into it. It's about one tanker of water for every man, woman, and child in India each year, which would be required just for that subcritical coal. Now, you know, in parts of India where you're from, how important that water debate is, and already we have at least 70%, if not 90% of water from groundwater or land surfaces allocated to agriculture. It just doesn't work. You can't add an extra kind of tanker truck for every man, woman, and child in India for coal on top of what has already been allocated to water. I haven't even mentioned greenhouse gas emissions. What I am talking about is the development trajectory of India with the fact that solar and other renewable options, but particularly solar, is now cheaper than subcritical coal. So wherever subsidies that are being played in terms of how one chooses the energy path for India, I think that there's a challenge also from the scientific community, and particularly from the water community. I'm on the board of the International Water Management Institute Board of Directors, and I think the water people have been not as effective as we could have been to kind of create that crosswalk between energy, agriculture, food, and how we deploy our resources. Because we do know that as the monsoon pattern changes, one of the biggest effects on India will be the fourth most affected economy in the world, will have a hit of about 8-10% on its GDP from these changing weather patterns, will be on water. So I'm trying to sketch out that this is not just a sort of hypothetical thing. It's kind of quite critical to the transformation of economies worldwide. It's a huge commercial opportunity, but there are also some development pathways that one needs to make some choices on. And if you are in any sense and position of influence, of which you all are, calling this out to say, how we grow an economy in the future that we're heading towards, and the types of goods and services and infrastructure that we put in will be as important about the security of that economy as it will be about a kind of green business opportunity. And I think it's incumbent on us all to be able to sketch that out for our colleagues who are in these governmental negotiations. So I hope it's a bit rapid fire. I hope it kind of creates some food for thought, but it's been a delight to share a few minutes with you, and happy to kind of chat in the sidelines. But just to thank you again for your time and attention. Thank you, MR, for allowing me the space to do this. And I hope you have a wonderful couple of days here with the Young Diaspora on climate action. It couldn't be more urgent, and you couldn't be in a better position, both from one of the leading emerging economies and your influence in the world economy, to help fix this challenge. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, my name is Sureel Desai from Mumbai, India. My question is, while we are talking about all these economic concerns about climate change and all, we are forgetting one very important and critical issue, which is going to be of climate refugees.
Yes.
And how do you think will that discussion go about in these negotiations? Because climate refugees are a real thing, and we are already seeing political refugees, but now coupled with that, climate refugees. So how is that going to go ahead in the future?
No, I really appreciate the question. I did touch on it briefly when I was talking about the kind of knock-on effects and the implications of people having to move within. There are a couple of risks and then a sort of solution set, if you like. So you've probably heard these statistics, but United Nations Refugee Agency are suggesting about 500 to 700 million climate-related refugees over the next 2 or 3 decades because of changing weather patterns. Most of those happen internally within a country or just within neighboring countries. It's not like from Central Africa into Europe. So that's a bit of a mythology. Most of it happens around kind of the border of a country or within a country. But there will be a lot. One of the most tricky issues is for those on small island states, because there's no human rights law yet for if your physical state disappears, how does that work? You're still a nationality, but you don't have a nation. Do you set up another nation? Well, we've seen some historic challenges of when a people without a nation state are placed into an area. I mean, it's very live time at the moment in the Middle East. So that's a real challenge. On the small island states as well, if we look at the new economy, there's a movement to call them actually large ocean states, because if you take the 200 nautical miles around the Marshall Islands, it's full of very, very interesting minerals to extract from the seabed for cobalt and lithium and all sorts of things. So there could be a high degree of economic importance for a people who don't actually have a nation. So it's a fascinating conundrum, which nobody's actually got an answer for. So that's two kind of slices of the challenge. One interesting thing, and if we take Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but also into the Sahara and beyond, it's very well known that for migration patterns, you'll go from rural to second tier to major city. You don't just suddenly up sticks, you kind of move. In terms of all of the built environment and technology and digital and smarts that we have, this actually offers a massively interesting opportunity for Indian diaspora investment, for Middle East or for others, to help the African Union create a whole new tier of second-tier cities across central and then into kind of Sahelian Africa, which could provide a brilliant urban living experience for people who would otherwise, be not knowing where to go. So that's an investment opportunity ahead of a challenge. If we look at Singapore, for any of you who live in Singapore, I mean, the closed-loop water system that Singapore have is outstanding. So, if it's going to happen, and we will get these ways of change, and we can actually build for that moving forward. So there's a sort of solution idea at a grand scale. And as the trade barriers come down between African Union countries, I mean, it's quite an interesting investment opportunity. Thank you. Good.
Sanjay Komera, CEO at Axel ESG, based out of Atlanta, US. I've got a couple of questions, maybe a couple of thought processes to you. Number one is, based upon my research, too much of solar is not good for this planet. Solar panels. One research article that I've read is, let's say you deploy solar panels in Thar, it's gonna make Amazon a desert, right? So, do you think there has to be a balance of how much of solar we use and also look at other options? Number one. Number two is, do you think companies, organizations, and also the governments should focus more on cheap carbon offsets, offsets in the sense cheap carbon capture, and converting that into energy? I think that's more viable solution because we humans, I mean, we're not gonna be net zero. Everybody wants to drive some nice cars, and it's difficult to become net zero. Even though we wanna be a net zero world, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, that's a great question, and let me pick that apart. We humans thought it would be impossible to create a whole new vaccine in 7 months. So, the impossible can become possible. If we kind of sit here and we're a bit defeatist, then nothing is possible. So it's a mindset shift, which is why this wave of innovation possibilities is super interesting. The IEA, in their Net Zero 2050 report, they're usually quite conservative, so I'm deliberately going a bit conservative. They're saying kind of a mix of about 70% renewables by 2050 will get us there, of which solar is one, offshore and onshore wind is another, hydro, big and small, is another, which is obviously applicable for India, and some other options. Electrification, batteries, big deal. So all of these kinds of innovations need to come through. Nuclear is in there. It's a mix of things. So a kind of a solar panel is not going to be our silver bullet, if you like. There's a kind of deployment of different technologies. It's a transition, so your point is well made, is that we're not going to suddenly stop what we're doing and start all of this. We have a kind of period, that's why we sort of talk about that 2050 trajectory and being on target by 2030 to get to 2050. And in that transition, as you know, I'm sure, like every company, when it's looking at how it is reorganizing its energy or finding its sources or reducing its emissions from operations and energy efficiency, which, by the way, is another big piece of the jigsaw, energy efficiency, heating and cooling, we'll always have a little bit left at the end of that each year, some emissions it's still got. And that's where issues like kind of carbon offsets start to come into play. Land, whether it's kind of forest or agricultural land, is super interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, it's about 30% of the emissions on the one side, but offers a huge opportunity space on the other. The oceans at the moment are saving us here. Oceans kind of absorb about 25% of all the global greenhouse gas emissions that are produced. About 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent goes in. Oceans take away, a chunk of that, and we're left with about 35, 36, 37, 38, depending, to fix. But that's kind of getting to the top. So the interesting thing is ocean provides a really, really interesting area of carbon sink. Land is quite complicated, obviously. People live on it and people grow things and there's trees. There's a really good example from the Southern Ocean. So bear with me on this one, but it illustrates kind of the intricacies of the problem. When we didn't have electricity, we used whale oil in the West, and whaling was a big deal. About 90% of the great blue whale and other whales were kind of taken away to make whale oil. It dropped from about 5 million to less than 900,000 whales, lots of them in the South Ocean. When whales go, the krill that they eat, the little shrimpy things, also go. When the krill goes, the plankton goes, which sits on top of the ocean. It's the plankton that is the stuff that absorbs the carbon from the atmosphere. No whale, no krill, no plankton. Whales, krill, plankton. And the studies have shown that actually over a decade you could get 3 gigatons of sequestration from that Southern Ocean spot. It's about the size of the European Union if we kind of re-established krill and whale. So a conservation win, a sequestration win, pretty interesting. And that doesn't mean that we have to kind of spend lots of time and money on quite small technical removal pieces. You can create a market for that, and that's, I think, where you're going, sir. And suddenly there's something super interesting, because for fisher folk who have to kind of deal with Antarctic waves, people are fishing krill to almost extinction, a little bit they got left, for omega-3 tablets for US or other kind of health supplements. Actually, you get that market right, and the krill is about 20, 30 times more valuable for the fishermen by leaving it there and allowing the whale to come back and sinking 3 gigatons of carbon into the ocean. So we get those economic incentives right. Fisher person wins, krill wins, atmosphere wins, and it's those sorts of opportunities. If I was an entrepreneur in your shoes, I would be looking that there's a mosaic of things where there's a lot of money to be made, a lot of atmosphere to be saved, and a lot of conservation to be achieved, which makes the whole space a super interesting opportunity, in my opinion.